LA to Tennessee is a
today
weird jump they've done.
it's great to have Sean Thomas from Pittsburgh to talk about supply networks and this compensation.
Well, thanks, Ian. Thanks for the opportunity to present the paper. This paper is at a point where it's particularly timely to get feedback. Even though we've had two versions of the paper, and this one's dated February 5th, both of them were done in advance of a deadline, and it's like that old apology, like I apologize for the length of the paper. If I would have had time, I would have written a shorter one. This one is, if I would have had more time, we would have written a better paper, especially a paper that maybe is has a little more depth to some of the theory that underlies it. And so from that standpoint, anything that you can offer would be greatly appreciated. The paper's joint work with Richard Yong and Yilin Wu at National Taiwan University. And what we're doing in the paper is, I think, pretty basic, but somewhat overlooked. And so this goes back to foundational principal agent theory. And if you apply these classical principal agent models to the settings between boards and CEOs, a couple of implications come out of them pretty quickly. One, if the CEO is taking unobserved actions, you should obviously make the compensation dependent on the output of the firm. And two, if there are other variables that can help the board to discern what the CEO's actions were, the unobservable actions, compensation should also be conditioned on those things. And the classic example that's given about these other observables that might provide unique information about the CEO's activities is the performance of firms similarly affected by exogenous common shocks. And what you can show is that there are a couple benefits that come out of this so-called relative performance evaluation. One is it reduces the CEO's exposure to compensation risk, specifically compensation risk coming from factors outside of the CEO's own control. And that leads to better risk sharing and it actually elicits more effort from CEOs than without this risk sharing. And second, it helps to increase boards' powers of inference about these unobservable managerial actions. And so what we can show is that compensation contracts move closer to first best when relative performance evaluation gets added to the contracting features. And a clear implication from these early theory papers is that the potential benefits of relative performance evaluation are increasing in the degree of exposure that the firms face to truly exogenous common shocks. And I'll talk in a few minutes about this CEO compensation literature and how it has sort of evolved over time and how this notion of exogenous common shocks has been built into the empirical specifications that are used. But one big advance that we take as sort of a jumping off point for our paper is that there's a lot better understanding now of how shocks in economies either originate or propagate through networks. And if you go back to sort of the arguments of like Lucas 77, there was this understanding or argument that these sectoral shocks that occurred, they dissipated pretty quickly, that they washed out as they moved through intersectoral linkages among firms and sectors of the economy. And that was based on law of large numbers arguments, standard sort of diversification stuff. But as people started modeling the economy based on these intersectoral networks using mostly the IO tables, especially those are the models we had in mind for this, Xavier Gabay and Hashimoto and Antros and Roll, now we have a much better understanding of where shocks come from and how long it takes them to dissipate. And it turns out, based on certain network features, that aggregate volatility is influenced and has its genesis a lot of times in truly sectoral, even firm level shocks. And so what we do is take these network models and basically use them as measures of exposure to exogenous common risk. And what we've sort of taken as a premise, we just accept, and there's some corroborating evidence for this, is that industries that are more central in the intersectoral trade networks or more upstream, so basic industries like extraction, they have higher systematic risk. They're more exposed to these shocks. And some of the corroborating evidence that started to come out comes from asset pricing papers. So Ken Ahern basically finds that firms that are central in the network have higher returns, all else equal, to firms that are peripheral. And so that even stands up when you put it into a factor. He makes a central minus peripheral factor, and it's significant even in the presence of the standard French factors and momentum. Michael Goffman, Segal, and Lee have a paper that's now forthcoming in the Review of Financial Studies where they build a top minus bottom factor. And so this is in layers of production starting from extraction industries all the way down to the bottom layer being those that sell to ultimate consumers. And again, you find this relationship that as you move upstream in terms of industry, returns are higher, all else equal. And the argument is they face more systematic risk than do firms that sell to ultimate consumers. And they have a model that illustrates this sort of vertical creative destruction that can account for this sort of return phenomenon. But again, we take most of this as given, and we basically use it to try and answer the following question. Is an industry's position in this intersectoral trade network an important determinant of how much of this relative performance evaluation they use in CEO contracting? And as a second order question, does it affect how they implement relative performance evaluation in terms of which peers they choose to measure, to benchmark the modal firm's performance against? And the short story is that we find that industries that are positioned more centrally or further upstream in the supply network do in fact make more frequent use of relative performance evaluation in CEO compensation contracts. It also affects how the peer groups are chosen. More specifically, those firms that are more central or more upstream, they choose really broad peer groups, indexes sometimes. And in fact, the S&P 500 index is a not uncommon peer group for those industries that are most centrally located in the network or most upstream. And so, we're not too worried about reverse causality here. Firms' production functions determine their input needs, and the CEO compensation contracts we're viewing those as being influenced coming from the network position as opposed to the CEO contract somehow affecting the firm's network position. Probably at the margin, there's something individual firms could do. They could use multiple suppliers that might move them a little bit in this network, but for the most part, the way we measure network position, we think we can say something causal about the network position affecting CEO compensation contracting outcomes. And that's pretty hard to do in this literature. I didn't know the CEO compensation literature all that well before I started this paper, and there are more papers than one could read in a lifetime on CEO compensation, so I won't claim to know every one, but what I do know is that there aren't very many of them that really have clean kind of identification. And I wouldn't argue this is perfect identification by any means, but it just seems pretty natural, especially at the industry level, that a firm's position in this intersectoral trade network is going to influence CEO compensation contracts, not the reverse. Now still, omitted variables and measurement error are concerned, so we'll have some controls and other things, but that's our setup. Right, so I did have a kind of enjoyable time reviewing this literature because I know someone mentioned at lunch maybe there aren't a lot of PhD students here or at the university, but this literature has a really clear genesis in the Holmstrom papers in the late 70s and early 80s. That's the foundational theory. And then you could see the empirics sort of build right off of it. And the first couple of papers, Antoine Smith and Gibbons and Murphy, really what they did was run CEO compensation against the own firm stock returns and peer firm stock returns. And they were looking for a negative coefficient on peer firm returns as an indication of how much or little relative performance evaluation was being used. And for the most part, they didn't find much. And the review that's cited here, the review article about Kaplan, basically after about a decade of that kind of research, they concluded relative performance evaluation, given how intuitive it is and theoretically compelling it is to be used, it was surprisingly absent from any of these returns tests. And then the question became why? And what I found pretty fascinating is that people sort of accepted the limitations of the data at the time and then went on to all of these explanations for why you wouldn't have relative performance evaluation. I mean, the theory is kind of...
confirmation bias.
Yes, the theory is
Big time.
pretty clear. And I wouldn't go so far as by no means to call these rationalizations, but all of these papers that took place then in the next decade or more were trying to explain why we shouldn't see relative performance evaluation. And some of them, obviously, if you're somehow in charge of an industry, if there's such a thing, relative performance evaluation induces competition. And if you want to tamp down competition or not induce a lot of competition, then you shouldn't be paying CEOs on the basis of relative performance. And so Agarwal and Sandwick had a paper arguing that the lack of relative performance evaluation in the data was due to an effort to reduce competition. Bertrand and Mullainathan also argue that paying for luck is just evidence that the CEOs themselves have captured the compensation contracting process. So they don't want this, and they have enough power to make the contracts reflect their preferences, and they do not want to be compensated on the basis of relative performance. They can shade it to their advantage. They get paid for good luck, and they don't get penalized for bad. So that would be a second potential explanation for why we don't see RPE. Garvey?
And this is because they had power.
Yes,
Where'd they get the power?
good question.
I mean, see, that's just a convenient thing you can say, but what he looks at.
Yeah, I mean, you could think it would vary with respect to entrenchment or other things. And these are obviously bargaining outcomes of boards and CEOs. And so there could be some instance, but I agree with you if your question is, this makes perfect sense theoretically. It's pretty easy and it's pretty cost effective to implement. But we can get stock returns from rival firms at almost no cost. So it's really hard to think about why the costs would outweigh the benefits. This idea that maybe there's some negative spillovers if we start compensating CEOs on this dimension, they will have less willingness to collude or work together to reduce competition and industry profits. Maybe, but again, as explanations that this should be kind of non-existent in the data, all of these I think do fall short for one reason or another. There was some theory that was developed, again, to perhaps explain why we shouldn't see RPE. And one, Oyer's paper in 2004, which is tested by Raj Polk, Garvey, and Milborn, is that if you don't compensate CEOs based on relative performance, what you're effectively doing is indexing their pay to their outside options. So when the industry does really well, even by luck, that is a time when the CEOs have good outside options, and by paying them a lot, you help to retain them within the firm. And when the industry does really poorly, even if by luck, you pay them less because their outside options are pretty low. And so again, you kind of make the argument that RPE would take that away. And so they do find some support for this model. But again, it falls short of explaining why this isn't present in the data. Or then there's this idea, well, if you have firms that can adjust their exposure to different sectors, like conglomerates, at somewhat low cost, well, maybe you don't want to pay conglomerate CEOs based on relative performance, because what you really want them to do is to pick the sectors that are going to be best. So give them an incentive to try and sector pick, if you will, and RPE would not. And also it's a little more unmanageable to index pay for a conglomerate CEO than for a focus firm CEO that just does one thing. This last sort of group of explanations is kind of, well, the data were bad. And there's a little bit of evidence now in retrospect to suggest that this is true. So the peer group definitions that all of these papers used were sort of guesses at what the peer group would be. And there are some natural ones, the other firms in the industry, broadly defined. But these papers have all found a little more evidence of relative performance evaluation, but in part that's because they have better data about who the peers are, or who they should be. So Albuquerque, instead of just using industry, They use industry and size as a double sort, and they find that if you benchmark pay, or you benchmark the returns of rivals against the own firm, using the rivals that are in the same industry, but also approximately the same in size, then you do see more evidence of relative performance evaluation. So this is kind of a noise explanation. Llewellyn chooses peer firms based on product descriptions. So now you get away from like production-based measures of industry like SIC codes, and you go right to see what the products are. Turns out tighter peer group definitions based on this dimension do in fact show more evidence of RPE. And the most recent effort along the same line, Jerry Ahman et al., they use the Hoberg and Phillips product market descriptions for product descriptions. And again, find better defined peer groups typically show on these types of tests more evidence of relative performance evaluation. Okay. Now we do have a big advantage, including this paper, and that starting in 2011, 2014, data on CEO compensation contracts became much more systematically available with a lot more detail. So this stuff has always been in 10Ks, but starting in 2006, firms had to report really detailed information on the contracts that they have with their CEOs. And an incentive, a group, Jeff Coles and some others, some academics put this data together at a cost of a couple $1 million of data collection. And now they've sold it to a data provider who we subscribe to and get this data from. But it's a really rich data set on CEO contracts. And some others have used it or collected the data themselves. And what they've found is that there is substantial evidence of relative performance evaluation use once you know exactly which firms are doing it and once you know which peer firms they're using. And so if you set up those same tests that the early literature were using, but you do them with better data, you do find some evidence. And from our perspective, the most interesting part of this prior literature is that when it comes time to put in a variable that's supposed to proxy for exposure to common exogenous shocks, what the previous literature has done is basically just included something like an industry beta. How much do your own returns move with the firms in your industry? And that's perfectly acceptable and quite natural. But what we sort of argue in this paper is that's probably an incomplete set of measures to explain or to proxy for exposure to exogenous common risk. Now, including these most recent papers with better data, Alex Edmonds and Xavier Davet and Dirk Genter recently completed another CEO compensation review paper, and again, including these papers here, argued that the evidence is still mixed and incomplete. In particular, there's a surprising number of studies that show that RPE is frequently not present where it's expected, and where it's present, the amount of filtering that's done in compensation contracts is probably too small. And so this kind of is where we come in. The theory is pretty clear. The benefits of RPE are increasing in the degree of exposure to exogenous common shocks. And so we look to see whether or not it is, in fact, more frequent in industries with greater exposure to such shocks. Yeah.
I just want to ask kind of a clarifying question, and it's just one. So in the so now we have the details. We can actually kind of see the contracts. We can see, exactly that, this is state base salary. This is what your variable pay is going to be.
Yes.
A function of. To what extent are those things kind of complete? And is there any issue, sort of regulatory-wise, in terms of being able to write explicit RPE contracts? And why aren't, if not, why aren't they actually done that way? If it's close to the first best.
So the second question first. So are there any regulatory restrictions?
Yeah.
On none that I'm aware of.
Yeah. Right.
It's all the outcome of, I think, a reasonably unconstrained bargaining between CEOs and boards. And to the best of my knowledge, there's not anything you couldn't write an RPE contract on. Right. As far as implementation, the vast majority of RPE is implemented through performance vesting of either restricted shares or options.
Right.
There are cash bonuses based on this, and usually they're rank order tournaments. So they don't necessarily.
So that's the closest way they come to actually directly implementing it.
Yes.
They don't do things like, we can't write sort of exotic derivatives on my competitors, so to my peer group's sort of equities, right?
Not that I'm aware of, but what,
That would be kind of odd to explain to the media press.
yeah, one thing they could do is just index the exercise price of the options
Yeah.
to the performance of rivals. And they don't do that. That's really uncommon. I think we'll have a slide in a few minutes. When it comes for the firms that implement RPE, it affects about a third of all-in compensation in a particular year. So that's the margin at which this RPE is affecting their compensation, on 1/3 of the total.
Does this sort of the, sorry, I'll follow up question. And does sort of the nature, this is sort of written, these are sort of have these kind of annual sort of exogenous timeframes, but the sort of the uncertainty kind of will result either across these sort of, the realization of sort of uncertainty of these shocks is clearly going to not be confined to such a year, correct?
That is correct. And oftentimes the performance measurement can be over, it's not uncommon to see a 3-year
Yeah.
window. And it's for exactly reasons I guess you can guess.
So is there a pattern across industries according to industry characteristics, whether for some industries you see RPEs used more often, like less competitive industries versus more competitive, like that?
Yeah, so that'll come up in some of the controls, but the biggest cross-industry characteristic that we see explaining this now is where firms are in this network of intersectoral trade. And it turns out, based on the empirical stuff, the upstreamness and the centrality measures that we'll use, they're the second biggest determinant of RPE use. And that's true of at least all the controls we use.
Does the investor base make much of a difference? I mean, if I've got one main investor, I can see why they're going to push me to perform well, but if all my investors are diversified, I mean, in some sense I already have the entire peer group in my portfolio. Do I really care if one firm does that much better than the other, as long as they're...
Right, so we'll include 2 variables for that. One is just institutional ownership overall,
Yeah.
but the second one is a common ownership measure. And there are arguments floating around out there now that one reason you don't see RPE is because there's this group of common owners that have bought both Coke and Pepsi,
Right.
and they don't want Coke and Pepsi competing away industry profits. They want them to act as a monopoly. And this is the explanation for why you don't see
Like
RPE.
a unique block holder probably would, I would expect to see more RPE if there was a unique block holder. Could be a,
Yeah, and again, I don't find those common ownership, and that's because some other work we've done. It seems like that's a somewhat unlikely explanation for the lack of use of RPE. This is all one sort of giant collusion game going on. But again, those explanations are out there, and they're investor based. So the characteristic of your owners might influence how much RPE you use. So we do include those as controls to some of the questions.
Clarification question. So when you're talking about the existence or non-existence of RPE,
Yeah.
do you mean something which is really in the contract, the compensation contract, or you're talking about the significance or insignificance of the coefficient of the regression of this compensation on the performance of the peer firm?
Good question. In the earlier papers, it was the latter. They were looking for this evidence of a negative coefficient on peer returns for own firm compensation. In our paper, it is it a feature of the CEO contract or not?
Okay.
And that's what the incentive lab data that we'll talk about in a minute, it has that level of detail. It tells you what is based on relative performance and what is based on either absolute performance, or there are some firms that have no performance incentives in their contracts. The CEO, and these could probably be characterized as founder firms, firms that are sort of unique, where the CEO takes $1 salary per year and has a big boat of options or shares that they own. So those are a little bit unique, but for the average firm in our sample, RPE use, again, accounts for about 30% of pay, or affects 30% of pay, but the way we operationalize the variable of interest is whether or not it's an explicit contract feature. So with respect to the data, and again, We hand collect a little bit to fill in some missing spots, but for the most part, all of our CEO contract information comes from this incentive lab database, which is really quite detailed. Now, given the collection effort involved to get all of these details, the initial sample was limited to 750 firms, the largest 750 in the US. But the way they've maintained this list is anytime someone joins the S&P 500 or drops out, they stay in the sample and they're backfilled if they're new, and they stay in if they drop out. And so over time, for the sample period we have, 98 through 2014, this ends up being 2,000 unique firms, not obviously for the whole panel, but it gives us a pretty big sample of CEO contract data, much bigger than we were getting historically when people had to hand collect these data. So you never saw a panel. Some people use 2006, the year these data first were mandatorily disclosed based on an SEC requirement. But always one cross-section or a short panel of, like, I think Antle and Smith, this kind of tells you how far we've come. The first paper to test RPE, I think they had like 63 firms for a couple of years. And now we can run much more substantial cross. And again, even though with this, there are limitations, right? These are only the biggest, essentially 750 firms to start with and roll forward. So we have definitely our data skewed towards really large firms.
I guess just two things about RPE. Can you adjust for the presence of private firms? Because just think about Marriott. Like Marriott really cares about Airbnb, right? So if you want to crush Airbnb, but they're not a public firm, so in some sense your biggest competitor is not something you can really do. Stock returns are available. And the second follow-up question was just like leverage. I mean, one crude thing about returns is when you start getting into the whole risk adjustment and the ball of wax, or the whole ball of yarn unravels.
So we don't do any of those returns-based regressions where we're looking at this coefficient on pure returns.
Right.
Because obviously those are going to be restricted
Okay, so
to
you
just
use the binary.
Yeah. And what we have by using the network centrality upstreamness measures, our data come from the BEA, and so that's establishment-based. We have private firms in these centrality measures and our upstreamness measures. They will in fact reflect all firms.
No, I'm just wondering if maybe one of the problems with RPE is that the returns themselves are so crude. Because nobody's doing it. I mean, maybe it's just a poor implementation of RPE. People shied away from it. Or
Yeah, good point. I would guess for our sample of firms, which are the biggest, it's pretty easy to find the other big competitors. So we're going to take these firms and split them into industries. And we're not starting with a huge sample. And so that influences how disaggregated our industry definitions can be. But within each industry definition, they're pretty well populated. And it definitely has the big competitors you would expect. Now, in the hotel, there is an industry that corresponds pretty closely to the hotels. And Hilton, Marriott, all of the big players are in there. And in our centrality measures, Airbnb, to the extent it has a hospitality IO code, it would be in there with them. But if we tried to do any returns tests, obviously, or where we have returns, and we do in our, some of our control variables are like rival return correlations, that's obviously only going to be based on the firms that are publicly traded. So yeah, we're missing. But as a practical matter, as a board trying to implement
it's worth your time to do this.
You'd be stuck with the same limitation, right? If you're the board, you can't get a return for Airbnb. Maybe you could use some other performance metric. And I'm trying to think of what variation I've seen in the contracts. There are some sales-based, but again, this was maybe just surprising to me and not everyone, but a lot of these RPE payoffs are based on rank order performance. So if you were first, you beat everyone else, you get a higher payment than if you were second, than if you were third. But there's not much in terms of distance. In fact, I don't remember seeing anything in terms of distance. And I think there's some pretty interesting potential implications of that in terms of, you're getting close to the end of the year, you're in second place, You can measure this stuff or keep track of it as you go. You can imagine managers doing things to put themselves over the edge, because all you have to do is move rank. You don't have to beat them by 5% abnormal return, but we don't look at any of that.
So would that mean that looking at the times that where the financial statements are due, I'm pretty clueless about this, but would there be like discontinuities around the times where financial statements are due? Would you be able to identify like manipulative behavior of managers around those times?
That's a good question. Firms reporting by industry does cluster in time by industry. Right? Toy manufacturers all reported in February or something. And to that extent, I don't know what the variation. I mean, I guess everybody knows everyone else's fiscal year end.
Yes, basically the ranking before the fiscal year end versus after, and then see whether there's.
Yeah, if you could observe it, I guess you could observe it 3 quarters in
Yeah.
to the fiscal year end and see did people make big moves in the last quarter to get slightly ahead of a competitor.
Do you see any information in the data about how the rank order, what the earnings profile of these executives are with respect to the rank order within their industry? Is there a premium placed on being in the top, or sufficient, or quite severe penalties for being at the bottom, or something like that?
What I've learned about these contracts are things I've read or looked at in the data, and it's not obvious to me that there are any of these kind of non-linearities where they're putting a lot of weight on really superior performance. Mm-hmm. It seems a little more mechanical than that, where it's just, again, that's...
Because there is a literature now on these sort of non-linearities and the returns from being, in certain rank order, for instance, for mutual fund managers, and taking on more risk. And the idea of sort of in the most abstract case, choosing risky distributions of return, say subject to a given mean or something like that. But I'm just wondering whether there's any evidence in anything that you've seen that something like that might play a role in this context.
It certainly didn't come through with just sort of a cursory look at the data and how and this incentive lab data is really detailed. It tells you some of that kind of information. A context where I do have some indications this goes on. We had a PhD student who was on the market this year, and she wrote her dissertation on basically predatory activities among mutual funds, because they're ranked, and rank has a big, performance has flow implications, and it turns out rank has a pretty big elasticity with respect to flow. And what she finds is some evidence, it's not widespread, but if you look at instances where there are 2 funds, it's getting close to the end of the year and they're pretty close in terms of rank, she finds evidence that the lower ranked fund will sell shares in which they have a smaller holding than the fund ahead of them to try and induce negative price pressure on a bigger holding of a superior ranked fund, and occasionally they do jump above the fund ahead of them in rank. And she saw this happening. She was a mutual fund manager in China and actually saw managers doing this. So she tried to apply it to US data, and it's not everywhere, but in instances she does a lot to get down to situations where it's feasible, and she does find some evidence that funds trade in a manner that allows them to jump, basically do less harm to themselves than they do to the competitor just ahead of them in order to switch ranks.
Does the low rank predict termination?
So in terms of CEO turnover, we haven't looked at that. It's on the maybe to-do list.
Yeah. So maybe it's not so well that I get a bonus if I do well, but I keep my job. Maybe yeah, that's the help.
Dirk Genter and Kanan have a paper that basically argue that RPE doesn't appear to be used in turnover. And what they seem to find is that there actually, a lot of CEOs get fired when the industry does poorly. And not, seemingly, if the industry is doing poorly, it's not any individual CEO's fault, but there are disproportionate, so their argument is that boards aren't really using RPE for retention decisions as much as they should. And they have some explanations for it, but it's still, I'd say, a little bit of a puzzle why it's not used. You shouldn't necessarily see bad CEOs all being fired when the industry's doing bad. It's just as informative if they're not performing well, if the industry's performing good, if they're a laggard.
And just one other thing, just heard to be kind of similar to the private firm thing. What about foreign firms? I mean, because those may not be in your data, right? But what if your biggest competitor is the foreign firm?
Good question. So with respect to our centrality measures and our upstreamness measures, as long as they have establishments in the U.S. that report through the BEA, they'll be in those measures. In the returns, like the rival return correlations, if they're listed on exchanges outside the U.S., we would not have their return correlation as part of that industry return. I'm trying to think what other variables would be affected by that, but there
I
are.
think one of the nice takeaways of the paper is that you really can't rely on return data, but you need this BEA to do a proper peer analysis. I'm just wondering if maybe we were afraid to implement it poorly using returns, because there's all these caveats, but maybe RPE will take off if we have this.
Yeah, potentially. And I should say up front, even though our conclusion is that the outcomes of the CEO compensation contracts do look as if boards are acting as if they know our firm is in the center of this network or is really upstream, and our firm is exposed to a lot of shocks that come from outside, maybe far away, but propagate through this network, and that the best response is to contract with the CEO on a way that shares risk through one of these RPE contracts. But I should search for some articles on this thing. What I have in mind more often is boards saying things like, we've been buffeted on all sides, or all markets are weak. You know, they have in mind, they've seen the firm perform over time, and they kind of know they've either learned or saw what's happened to firms, because something that starts, a virus transmits from animals to humans in Wuhan, and firm sales in the US go down, or their ability to get the supply of important inputs goes down. My perception of what might be going on here is that boards they're not mapping these centralities the way we have it, saying, aha, this is the variable upon which we should decide whether or not to use RPE. But I think it would just occur to them naturally that they've observed firm performance over time, saw what shocks have come from somewhere, and maybe in new places all the time. And as more of this has happened, there is some evidence in our data that the way the network has changed over time, especially with firm concentration in the US, that the use of RPE has gone up kind of secularly. So not just variation within industries, but because firms now make these statements like, we could be affected by so many things, and we have been affected by so many things, that RPE is just the appropriate way to contract.
Could it be also, in terms of identification, I can see that this story of I have the network and then I can use the RPE in more central ones. But what about the supply? Could be the case that CEOs good CEOs have a preference for more central industries or more central firms and for RPE, right? So I don't see
So
why.
selection.
Yeah, so selection coming from the supply. And of course, every firm can get one the good CEOs, right?
Right. We have not, like for instance, one way to maybe to see if that's happening in general is to look at whether the CEOs in these central and higher upstream industries are paid more. Mm-hmm. And we haven't done that. At least I don't think any of our tests would speak to that. But that would be a way to at least see is there any obvious, and clearly the different industries, CEOs are going to get compensated differently for lots of reasons, but I don't know, we do have some talent flow measures between industries that comes up in the firm level analysis, and it affects the peer group. So for instance, if you're a firm in this industry and you've lost employees, or in the labor data you see employees having moved from this industry to that industry, the more of those flows that take place, the more likely that the firms in that second industry become peers or used as peers. And so that's kind of a dynamic measure, and it doesn't have to just be rivals. If tech hires away a bunch of your executives, you see in subsequent periods, tech firms become more often the peers against which RPE is benchmarked. I'll have to think about that a little bit.
Yeah, kind of so. I maybe should have asked this a long time ago, but so there seems to be a tension between the notion of centrality and upstream. I mean, what's the definition of centrality used here? Is it the network theoretics?
Yeah, I will get there in like
You
one
will,
slide.
okay, great.
Yeah,
Okay.
both upstreamness and
Okay.
centrality. Yeah, we have to define what those are and exactly what we're referring to here. That's good with the data. So again, consistent with this being a subset of all publicly traded firms that are in this ISS Incentive Lab data, the fraction of CompuStat firms that are in our sample runs somewhere between 20 and 25% of all CompuStat firms. But with respect to the fraction of total sales that these firms represent, it's over half. So again, this shows you we're selecting on really big firms as a result of the way these data are collected. With respect to the fraction of firms that use RPE, the first year when there were only 700 and some firms collected, the percentage was around 20%. As more firms got added to the sample in the first couple of years that the data got rolling, that number dipped. So they added a lot of firms to the sample that did not use RPE. And over time, the percentage of firms using relative performance evaluation has grown quite dramatically. And now it's closer to 50% of all firms. And one distinction, and we do this throughout the paper, is that we measure the fraction of RPE use either relative to all firms that are in this data set, or relative to the firms that use absolute performance evaluation. And absolute performance evaluation is just, it's not relative to your peers, it's how well do you do relative to a stated goal. And so there are firms that, and one reason for this distinction and why we might want to run things both ways is because these firms that don't have either relative performance or absolute performance, my perception is that a lot of them are founder firms or family firms where these performance incentives just aren't used. And so they're a little bit unique. And so benchmarking the firms' RPEs against a sample of firms that only use absolute performance evaluation at least keeps us within the groups of firms that have some performance evaluation, not just time vesting.
But my opinion is that even time vesting potentially is not performance based, right? Performance vesting is just add extra layer of kinks.
Yes, and I think in the time vesting you have to still be employed by the firm. So it's kind of if you don't stay, if you're turned over or fired, then time vesting is in fact a performance benchmark.
And also those are time vesting are generally restricted stocks. Right.
And options.
And options.
Yeah.
And so it is tied to stock performance still.
Sure. Yeah, because the payoff is certainly tied. I think the fraction of vesting, it's not unusual, maybe you know best, so correct me if I'm wrong, but the time vesting is generally something like a third after 3 years, a third after another 3, and a third after 9 years, if they're 10 or 12-year options. And so that just occurs provided you stay with the firm. So yeah, there's a performance element, and certainly the payoff is going to depend on firm performance. With respect to the peer group choice that firms make, so conditional on using relative performance evaluation, somewhere between 60 and 75% of firms actually choose selected peers, so that the compensation contract says these are the peers, and that includes individual firms. Now, the remaining fraction are firms that use RPE. There are a few for which we don't get the peer group information, but the vast majority of 100% minus these are firms for which they've chosen an index, sector index, or a more broadly reflective index of firms as the benchmark. And so finally, with respect to the fraction of total compensation, it affects somewhere around a little less than a third on average. So it's where used, it's a pretty high-powered incentive, or it affects at least a significant fraction of pay, I should say.
So who are these, how they select, they're self-selected?
The firms that are in the sample?
Yeah.
Yeah, this is based on size. So they started
Oh, no.
with-
So in the last column, the second to last column, yeah. So how do they how they choose which particular firms to put in the contract?
So there's a fair amount of evidence that firms rely on compensation consultants to help them do that, but it's up to the board.
Okay.
So the board,
And do they hire consultants?
some do. I think there's a paper that shows there's a consultant fixed effect in these peer groups. Consultants do the work once to find out what the right peers are, and then they just charge everybody. Yes, sir.
In terms of ranking, those peer firms are usually higher in rankings than this focal firm, lower, or?
So for performance-based compensation, so I should make a distinction. There's a literature on the choice of peers for performance, which is what we're looking at, but there's also a literature on the choice of peers for compensation. And this is more like who gets paid what, and there's evidence to show that those peers are more often not related in terms of same industry, customer, supplier, and most frequently they are, when they're chosen, at the time they're chosen, their CEOs make more than the CEO of the firm for which they're chosen to be a peer. And it's a CEO pay level benchmarking exercise is how it's characterized. And so some people look at that critically and argue that this is obviously a situation where the CEO has captured the board because they get to choose these pay benchmark firms that aren't used for performance. Some of the very last tables in our paper may look at this distinction, who gets chosen as performance peers versus who gets chosen as compensation peers. And the performance peers are always more central, they're in the same industry, they have all these natural links to be a benchmark, whereas the compensation peers, they're more tenuously related, but if anything, their most common defining feature is that they're firms at which those CEOs get paid more than the CEO of the firm they're chosen. And again, you can interpret that a couple of different ways. Some people are pretty highly critical of it because they say it's just an exercise in CEOs getting more compensation by getting benchmarked against people that are higher paid. It's kind of like every time we hire a rookie and the salary has gone up $20,000 from the year before, all of the seasoned associates and fulls go running in to say, look at the differential in our pay has gone down. I need to be paid more to reinstate this differential. Our dean's not always convinced by that, but that's one potential explanation for why you see. And again, the compensation consultants come in for some criticism here too, because they're often behind these choices of peers. All right, so again, we use the Bureau of Economic Analysis input-output tables to build these networks. And this data come in a couple of varieties, but they record production activities, including services and goods, in U.S. producer prices. And they're available on an annual basis at a sector or a summary level. And now every 5 years, there's a really detailed level, but this has to do with how many industries the firms are split up in. And so the sector level IO codes, there are only 14 of them. And the detailed level, there are more than 400. And we're starting with a sample of firms that in the first year is only 710. It grows to be 12 or 1,300. So the kind of Goldilocks choice for us is the 65 summary level IO codes. They get pretty good population in every industry. We exclude the government industries, and we combine two industries because they have the same NAICS code. But then what we do is further isolate these connections in terms of how big they are, and we just require that to develop this supplier network, that the industry that we're calling the supplier industry supplies at least 1% of the inputs used by the customer industry we're calling customer J here. So this is a representation of what the network looks like in the US at this summary level. And we probably belabor this point a lot in the paper. Because other papers have used the really detailed networks, and we can't quite do that, we want to make sure that this network has features that look like those others. And so this representation, so the node size here is based on the number of degree connections. So just how many other industries are you a more than 1% supplier of? And the bigger industries here are the suppliers to more other industries. Really small ones, I think 113FF is fishing. It supplies obviously maybe just 1 or 2 industries with fish. Whereas paper products, utilities are 22. Management services, suppliers of like measurement, engineering firms, they're pretty central in this network.
So how time persistent is this measure?
We'll see that in a minute, but they're pretty persistent. Now, you can find individual industries that have had reasonably large changes in their centrality. So for instance, in the US, as energy production has switched from coal to natural gas, coal has gotten a lot less central than they used to be, and natural gas has gotten more central. None of those, at least in our at our level of aggregation, and for the sample window we have, the time series variation in these network measures is just not going to be very big.
And then, how does this measure correlated with like a traditional industry data? Is it positively correlated? Is it highly correlated?
With industry data?
Yeah, something like that, like industry return regress on market return.
The Internet Appendix has the correlation matrix for these measures along with all the right-hand-side variables that we use, one of which is arrival return correlation. I don't remember off the top of my head how, we would argue that the more central industries do have higher betas. That's kind of Ken Ahern's result. And the more upstream industries also have higher betas, which is the Goffman, Segal, and Wu paper. So those are documented, but how high the correlation? I mean, we end up putting them all in the same regression. So if that was the explanation, they shouldn't load. But I'll have to look if you want to.
So another question is, this is like measure supplier centrality. But what about the opposite side is the customer centrality? If it's like say, I depends a lot on other firms
Sure.
as my customer, that should be the same argument, right?
Not necessarily. So they're correlated. So if you built this network from the other side, who are the central customers? They're going to be the customers that are purchasing the most. And I think if you measure these, and we have them, the correlation is less than 0.5, but it's significantly positive. But what's preferable here, and it will become apparent I think in a minute, is this upstreamness measure has a really nice interpretation and corroborating evidence from the asset pricing literature that the firms that are selling to ultimate consumers, which would typically be those firms that are most central in the customer network, right? If you're a retailer, you're buying from lots of different industries, and it's coming down to you as the last step between all of those other industries and the consumers. So you would be really highly central in a customer network, whereas in a supplier network here, retail firms are not very central because they don't have other firms as customers. And so that's where I see a big difference between the two. Yeah.
So is there a way to capture the similarity of what these industries are doing? So you talked about like the paper products industry. I would assume that 2 firms in the paper products industry are doing very similar things, whereas 2 firms in the retail industry may be more distant or not quite as similar.
Yep, and we end up using the Hoberg and Phillips similarity measure. So it's based on product descriptions.
Okay.
And so we can basically, once we identify the industries and say these are the 10 firms in it, we can calculate the differences in those total similarity measures. And where there are really small differences, we say they're all doing the same thing. Where there are really big differences, it's an industry classification that seems to be catching a a bigger dispersion of actual activities.
So if you're using this network for your centrality measure, that means that you think that it's that basically the important shocks are the ones that would be from shared supplying rather than shared demand shocks, right?
Well, this network, so the way the edges here are running potentially in both directions,
Okay.
and because of the way we've aggregated these industries, there are in some cases, I don't know if I can see one, about a third of possible linkages are actually mapped. So there are, of the, 65 times 65, 42, 25 or so, there are 1,160 edges. So there are 3/4 of possible supply relationships here that don't exist. And there are, and I don't know if we can see any of them, because the program that we use to generate this representation, I don't know if we turn this on in this version, but there are certainly instances where actually this arrow departs and comes back to the same industry. So within farming, they supply themselves with seed. So you get this, they're both their supplier and the producer, or the supplier and the customer. Does that answer the question?
Mine was more just about the fact that, what type of shocks do you think shared shocks are important? It looks like the supply shocks, the shared supply shocks you're most concerned about rather than the shared demand shocks. I guess you assume the demand is just more disaggregated in all cases, really, so it's less subject to common shocks.
Yeah, I guess with G's suggestion, we could in fact use this same representation using customer centrality, and that might, if you think shocks are coming from shocks to ultimate consumer demand, that would...
An aggregate measure, just whatever the direction, right? It can be customer supplier direction, but you can generate the same centrality measure.
Yeah, one thing we could do and haven't is we can close this network. So we can take the tables themselves, if we add back a couple of government industries and then you need some catch-alls to get like scrap and some other things, we can actually create, I think it's called a social accounting network, that is essentially a closed network that has, this is just a little more, because of what Ajimolu and Gabe, the way they built their networks, we do the same, because it kind of has the most natural relationship to what we're trying to do. But there's nothing that would prevent us from doing that.
And one other question is that, is the edges here weighted, or are you just using the unweighted graph?
In these, they're unweighted.
Okay.
Yeah, it's just, are they greater than 1%? So we haven't made like, these are thicker if they're bigger. And I should say up front, I'm giving credit to Richard. Richard is the guy that produced this representation. And I'm very happy that he did, because I'd be hard pressed to do the same. All right, so with respect to which centrality measures we're using, because you've got a little bit of a choice, we use degree centrality, which is just simply the number of industries to which you provide you're an important provider of inputs. Because you might be central in the network, not by virtue of just the industry you supply, but the other industries they supply. So if you supply a really central industry yourself, you're actually more central than just your own direct links. So we use eigenvector centrality as a second measure. And the upstreamness measure, this comes from Antros and Roll and a couple of others. This is the number of stages that an industry enters the production process above ultimate consumers. So ultimate consumers are 0, retailers are 1, wholesalers are 2, and up all the way to basic extraction being somewhere around 4 or 5. And we'll look at some summary statistics for each of these. So on average, industries are directly linked to about 17 other industries. And this is out of a max of 65 or 64, given there are 65 total. It's clearly right skewed, the median closer to 10 or 11 direct links. And we've calculated the coefficient of variation of this degree sequence of the network for each year. So this coefficient of variation has, it's an indication of just how much these degree sequences vary in size. And there are some nice, there's some nice relationships that have been derived within this production network or intersectoral trade network literature to show that this coefficient of variation can be a really important characteristic of the network. And in particular, where you see a lot of dispersion in degree centrality, it potentially tells you that there are a lot of sectors that have play a disproportionate role in intersectoral trade. And so it's these kinds of industries that lead to sectoral shocks transmitting through the network and turning into aggregate shocks. If this network looked like, say, a pentagon with equally sized nodes in each of the points and equally sized edges, we could stop here because it would say that no industry is particularly subject to sectoral shocks, either hitting them from outside or propagating through them. And so this network having this variation, and we're not the first to show this. The reason we kind of spend a lot of time on this is because we're the first to do it at this level of aggregation. And so we just want to make sure it has similar properties to others, and it does, which is useful. But this coefficient of variation, as this number gets higher, it basically says the US economy has evolved in a way such that sectoral shocks are more likely to propagate into aggregate shocks to output. And so people have argued that because of the concentration in US industry that we're getting more and more subject to idiosyncratic or sectoral shocks starting far afield and propagating into aggregate business cycles. Now with respect to upstreamness, the average industry comes in at around 2. So the average industry here is a wholesaler, but there are in fact, these are the yearly, so G, you asked earlier about how much variation. You can see there's not a ton. It's pretty stable.
Yeah, so this is my concern is that this is basically an industry-wide characteristic.
It
that
is.
basically can be captured by something like an industry dummy, right?
Yes.
So there is a concern that maybe some other industry characteristics like either incorporated or highly correlated, right? You mentioned there are cases, there are certain industry did experience significant change in the centrality. I think those cases would be more interesting. Or, for example, if they went through like vertical mergers, I would think that will cause some changes in the centrality.
So we'll do we can rule out a couple of those as being the explanation for the results. Like in one subsample, we'll only include one subsample, or in a test on a subsample, will only include, I can't remember if it's industries or firms that had no change in their code, which meant they didn't go out and do an acquisition significant enough to influence the code that they're in, the industry that they're in based on this classification. With respect to, could you replace centrality or upstreamness with just an industry dummy? While each industry's centrality is relatively, doesn't vary a lot, there is a lot of variation across industries. So an industry dummy wouldn't necessarily, to the extent that we're seeing, and like for instance, in one of the later tests, we'll look at the uptake. So we saw this increase in RPE use. We look to see whether that uptake is greater in more central industries, and it is. And I don't think that's something that would necessarily come out of just an industry fixed fact. I don't know, let me know if that doesn't, as we go through this, if it doesn't satisfy your question, don't hesitate to let me know. Yes, sir.
A question about the upstreamness. What do you do if you have something that enters at different levels? Do you take the lowest, the highest, or the average, like farm supplies to like food producers, but also straight to consumers?
So you mean in terms of the actual calculation of this?
Yeah.
The details are in the paper, but this measure ends up being continuous, and it does take into account where all of the links.
Okay.
So it's getting
something like an average, but more complicated than that.
Yes.
Yeah.
And so just really quickly in terms of what these look like over the whole sample period, we're going to have 1,012 industry years in the industry level tests, 17 direct links. And again, this skewness coefficient here is basically, these are right skewed. And so we're going to have to take logs of the centrality and upstream as measures using them. Again, I don't see anybody pushing back a lot on this, but we were concerned that we need to show that our network has properties similar to that shown in the really disaggregated network, where they're using 420 different industries. So what we've done here is a counter-cumulative distribution. So it's both in logs. And what this shows is the degree centrality. And in this sort of far right tail of the distribution, it is, the far right tail is fat. Basically saying that there are a disproportionate number of industries in the US economy that are susceptible to shocks coming from lots of other places in the network. And this, as a measure of it, this power law function, you can estimate on a tail and this alpha parameter, and we can compare this with others that have done this at the really disaggregated level. This is a pretty low alpha, which says that this right tail is fat. And so if this weren't the case, then again, you wouldn't expect firms to be varying too much in terms of how susceptible or exposed they were to these exogenous shocks. But this network exhibits that property, and so we can use it seemingly the same as others. Now, one thing we did, and this is maybe a matter of taste, but that coefficient of variation variable before, which is just a coefficient of variation of degree centralities each year, so the degree sequence, we regress that against the use of RPE overall. And there are only 17 observations, but to our sort of great surprise, there's a significant positive relation. So as the economy in the US, in a levels-based measure, has gotten more susceptible to sectoral shocks turning into aggregate shocks, firms have in fact used more RPE. Now, again, we do a couple of things here. We use the percentage of RPE among all firms. Because the tests that are going to come after this are at the industry level, we recalculate RPE as the mean of the industry frequencies, and then we weight them by output. And in each case, there's a significant positive relationship. And again, we're not going to put much weight on this at all. But this isn't one of these kind of, Tyler Vegan has this website that shows these correlations, which are really crazy. The number of movies in a year that Nicolas Cage acts in is really highly correlated with the number of people that die by becoming tangled in their bed sheets. And
Nightmares.
yeah, that's an explanation I haven't heard before, but that fits. Like Bernard Hertzkovic at UCLA has a paper basically relating overall network properties to systematic risk. And so this is supportive of that at a really basic level, that as the network has evolved to be more interconnected with more central properties, firms have sectorally started using more, or I should say in a sectoral or a secular manner, have increased the use of RPE. Now, again, maybe in 1963 this would have gotten us a publication, but with only 17 observations, we're not counting on that. So we can do a little better when we break this into the 65 industries in our sample, and we just plot them. Centrality within each sector is towards the center, and the dark circles here are industries that use above median RPE, and the light circles are industries that use below median RPE. And when my co-authors and I first produced this plot, I looked at it and said, wow, awesome. They looked at it and said, woo, I don't know. So this is like one of those magic eye illusions where depending on how you look at it, you could come with different conclusions. But if you just put this red circle and that bisects each sector, each sector pi at sort of the center point of its radius, what you find is there are about 25% more high RPE industries in the center of the circle than light. So a single univariate sort of industries based on centrality doesn't explain everything, but there is, it is the case that more industries that tend to be more central in the network do more frequently have above median RPEs. So at a basic level, there's a correlation here. With respect to upstreamness, it's a little more obvious, I think. So the mean extreme upstreamness is between 1 and 2. And what you find is if you, again, put a similar reference point in, there are somewhere just a little less than twice as many high RPE industries in the upstream, more upstream industries in the economy than in the low end. So retailers and those that sell to ultimate consumers tend to more frequently be low RPE as the hypothesis, consistent with the hypothesis.
Sorry, what are different colors?
So the dark circles, these are industries that you have above median relative performance evaluation frequencies. And if one univariate plot showed everything, it should be all dark circles up here and all light circles down here. What we find is it runs about 2 to 1 dark up here. Not quite 2 to 1, just a little less. And each industry, depending on how much output it produces, gets a bar. Clearly, manufacturing is the widest bar here. Now, we can do better than just a plot. We can actually just put these into regressions and run the continuous. And so, if we regress the frequency of RPE use within an industry on the industry centrality measures, these first, and the upstreamness measure, these first 3 coefficients show us the relationship, and it's positive and significant in each of the 3 measures. Again, for this reason I mentioned before, where some firms don't have any performance evaluation in their compensation plans, and maybe they're a little bit weird, we've also calculated the frequency of RPE used not against all other firms, but against firms that at least have some kind of performance evaluation, and the results are similar. And in these last 3 columns, we're regressing the centrality against whether or not the firm has chosen a broad index of peers versus a self-selected small group. And so more upstream and more central industries are less likely to use a specific peer group and more likely to use a broad index, consistent with them being more worried about more general shocks to productivity or aggregate shocks than more specific.
So this broad index include both like industry level index and S&P 500.
Yeah, in that last distinction, we're not cutting it really finely. It's just, do you use a small group of specifically identified peers, or do you use some sort of index? It has to be an index that is specified. Mm-hmm. So like the Russell 1000, 2000, 3000, S&P.
Yeah, I know like firms that are using, say, okay, retailer kind of return index, mm-hmm. or versus, that would be an industry specific index versus the general market index. But I'm not quite sure how that kind of works with the story that you have. For example, if I know my industry is subject to the shocks, the aggregate shock, then as long as I'm benchmarked with the rest of my industry, I should be already filter out that risk, right? Then why should I, use a general market index?
In one slide, we'll come back to that if you don't mind. Because what we're going to add next is this rival return correlation variable. And if the argument that you're making is that I don't need to worry about industries up or downstream for mine, as long as I benchmark against my rivals and we're all similarly affected, mm-hmm. what do I care about those? Mm-hmm. But as an empirical matter, it's going to turn out that these variables continue to have explanatory power even in the presence of rival return correlation. So they're capturing something that rival return correlation either omits or measures incompletely. And there is some there is some explanation of what those things might be. But hold on for that one more.
When I'm thinking about relative performance evaluation, should I be thinking about if I have a group of 5 of us and I'm the top, I get 100% of my bonus. If I'm second, I get 75%. Or should I be thinking like if I'm in the top 3, I get it versus the bottom 2, I get nothing? Or how should I think about RPE?
Sure. The most frequent implementation is a rank order. So you get, it's the percentage of your, say, restricted shares that vest at some time period. So after you get a restricted stock grant today, it's 0 vesting. At the end of 3 years, one of these relative performance evaluation assessments will be made. If your rank in that list of firms in the industry is at a certain point, that influences the fraction of your shares that vest. The more other firms you beat, the more shares that immediately vest to your ownership.
And that's pretty standard, like there's not much variation you could use instead of a dummy variable?
It's a good question. I'm trying, in my sort of deep looks into the data, I didn't see a lot of variation, but we have the, this incentive lab data is incredibly detailed, and I wouldn't rule out that you could run that sort of thing, and that's something we should check. I mean, you're thinking a little bit more, do you turn it on or off, and then this is what we're doing, do you turn it on or off, versus how much do you turn on or how little.
I'm curious why you're doing, I mean, you've averaged this number. You've taken all these binary numbers and averaged them across the industry rather than running a probe bit and allowing you to, say, predict that for each firm, right?
So
I mean, that's the data I think you're showing.
So why are we running a TOBIT?
Yeah, rather
because about 26% of the industries use no relative performance evaluation. So it's there are a lot of zeros in terms of RPE use.
Well, but it seems like there's a lot of variation within the firms that you're averaging and you're losing. Losing explanatory power to explain why it's 2 to 1 rather than all on the top and not none in the bottom.
Well, we will run a firm level analysis
Oh, okay.
in a few minutes.
All right, cool.
Probably the part that's not going to be entirely satisfying is the network measures that are explanatory variables. They're still going to have to be, all firms in the industry get the same network measure. And the only way we could do better than that, and there's a paper now that I think provides a path forward on this. They've created a supply network, this intersectoral trade network, not from the BEA tables, which are just this industry sells to that industry. They've linked actual firms being customers and suppliers. They don't know the weights. They don't, as long as you buy, Sears buys from Mattel, that's in there, and they can't ever put a weight on it like we can. But what they can do is basically then say for each firm, that Sears' network centrality might in fact be different than Kmart, than Target, and that would be a little closer to a firm level measure of centrality. But we don't do that yet. Anybody else have a question? All right, so the regression where we really start to try and take magnitudes here is once we do include this rival return correlation, because this is what the previous literature used to control for exposure to exogenous common shocks. And again, we don't have a real bone to pick. This measure probably should be in here, and it's well motivated, but the information that we now have about the way networks are structured and the way shocks propagate suggests that this may not be, in fact, a complete measure of exposure to exogenous common shocks. And so we run, not exactly a horse race, but by including these together, we can see if there's any independent explanatory power of the centrality measures, and there are. In fact, the explanatory power, if anything, goes up for the centrality measures in the presence of rival return correlation. And obviously, there's some pretty big caveats to interpreting R-squareds from TOBITs, but the frequency or the amount of variation that these centrality and rival return correlations explain is somewhere around 1/3. And so when this literature in the past has said we don't see RPE where it's expected, at least with this set of tests, we can say, well, yeah, in fact, we do see it where it's expected. In those industries that have a lot of exposure to exogenous common shocks, RPE use is significantly higher. And that's what the theory predicts.
So can I see the previous slide real quick? There was the significance sort of, and obviously you sort of see how the magnitude actually, I mean, the actual coefficient value seems to jump a lot, at least in terms of the centrality. When you add that sort of risk correlation.
Yes.
So what is the nature of the correlation between, you go to the next slide, I'm sorry. I don't mean to drive it.
Sure.
Between the rival return correlation in this and that sort of centrality.
Good
Because we
question.
see that, yeah.
The correlation's reported in the Internet Appendix. It's attached to the paper. I don't
Oh, I mean,
remember
the
off
deep of the,
the top of my head.
Yeah, but somehow, some of that, if the more central we become, then we actually have a stronger correlation. Is there a positive correlation between becoming more center and having this kind of correlation risk?
So you're talking about the
Yeah.
variables in this
Yes,
area.
yeah.
We don't really do much with that other
Yeah.
than to, like for instance here, these
It does
marginal
seem-
effects.
Yeah.
And you can, this is where earlier in the slide, or earlier in the talk, when I said, these are not the prominent explanatories. So this still does have the biggest, and these marginal effects are calculated for the non-censored observation. So non-censored use of RPE runs about 30%. And what this is, these are showing that you're moving pretty substantially with respect to centrality.
Yeah,
If you vary centrality by one standard deviation, especially for these two, where you vary upstream this, it's moving it, but it's not moving it as far as high rival return correlation. And a really good explanation, at least one I buy, is that if you don't have a bunch of identifiable rivals, you really can't implement RPE. And so the more rivals you have and the closer the return correlations are, the easier it is to implement RPE. And so that explains a fair amount of the variation in its use, just because this is a practical measure of whether you can do it or not.
Yeah.
These measures, I think, well, we argue they capture something different than just that.
Yes, that triggers sort of a thought, and then it seems like that a lot of times we're sort of thinking about firms sort of being in, your analysis is assuming a firm lives in a specific one. Well, they're sort of pretty much there's larger, more central ones that we expect to have be multi-sector, and so this is kind of a censoring that maybe is capturing that. Obviously, if we have more divisions, maybe that sort of reduces our risk exposure. Yeah. Okay, it's coming up.
Yes.
Okay, sure.
Because this is still an industry level regression,
Yeah.
but when we go to the firm level stuff, we do have whether or not the firm is a conglomerate, how many industries it's in. Again, the weakness is still when you go back up to our variables of interest, they're still defined as if all firms in the industry have that same centrality.
Yeah.
But you're right, if they have different feet in different industries, the centrality measure wouldn't reflect that specifically. It would to the extent that all firms in the industry had a similar, where you see coal mines and electricity generating plants always together,
Right.
this centrality measure would reflect that. But where they're not, or where there's variation within industry of how frequently that happens, our measures are going to fall a little bit short of capturing that.
Are there many firms that try to deliberately change industry, like coal trying to become renewable or something like that? The job of the CEO is to completely get us out of this because it's got no future to get us over here.
Well, one argument against the use of RPE, and I don't know how compelling it is, but it provides incentives for managers to stay in dying industries, just to be the best of an industry, even if it's going out, because that's what you're compensated based on. You don't really have a lot of incentive to try and move out of that industry, even if that's what shareholders might prefer. But I don't know how strong that is.
Although that actually kind of works with what you see in the sense that maybe more central industries, they don't really care about preventing people from moving industries because they're already in so many, in so many pots, they don't worry about the industry dying, whereas smaller, less connected industries might be more worried about that and therefore avoid that RPE.
Yeah, that's sort of the flip side of being exposed to a lot of industries, is that you're not exposed to the idiosyncratic risks associated with one industry, something bad happening to them. You're exposed to everybody, essentially. And that's why you, at least that's our interpretation of why you see those kinds of firms choosing peer groups that are really broad, including the market. I mean, if you're the most central node in this network, it makes perfect sense to choose basically the whole market as your peer, because that's what you're affected by. In terms of time management, I know I promised a couple of things here. Talked about the marginal effects. Somebody asked earlier about ownership. So there's a little bit of evidence here that if you have a lot of common owners, institutional owners, you actually use more RPE. So this kind of goes against this argument that, and there are other papers that show this more prominently. So it doesn't appear as though the lack of RPE use is driven by common owners trying to manage or coordinate collusion. Somebody asked earlier about, does it matter whether the industries have within them a lot of variation? So this measure essentially says that when the industries have more similarity, there is more use of RPE. And that's, I think, for an obvious reason that these peers are a more representative benchmark than if the industry is doing. In fact, I think there's some evidence that RPE gets used a lot in commodity industries, because there it's pretty simple. You're all selling the same thing. Whoever does it the best clearly did it the best. And there's not a lot of other things you could blame it on. Because we use the return of the firms within the industry, so sort of like an industry beta, we've also included here, loosely speaking, the other piece of the beta, the industry market return correlation. And we've included a variable here that includes the fraction of firms in Incentive Lab versus all of the firms in CompuStat. And this is kind of a check on measurement error. If we know we're not getting all of the firms in each industry, and so the fraction of firms in the industry doesn't appear to correlate with anything we find about. Yeah, very quickly. We also run this at the firm level, alluded to several times. And again, the results are pretty consistent with those at the industry level, both in terms of explanatory power and which variables load. What's not shown here are somewhere in the neighborhood of 25 control variables. And I'm trusting my co-authors here who do CEO compensation to know what those are. It's probably a little easier to say what we don't include. We do not include whether the CEO drives a sports car, whether they have a pilot's license, or whether they have an Ashley Madison account. Now, all of those have shown up in the literature on CEO compensation, but ours are much more tenure, experience, and I guess economically related. Somebody asked earlier, is there uptake and dropping of RPE? And basically, as that frequency of RPE use has gone up over time, where has it gone up? It's gone up more frequently in the central and upstream industries. And firms switching away from RPE are typically less likely to be in the upstream and central industries. Same is true with peer group choices. This is a regression of who gets chosen as peers. And what we find is that distance, in terms of centrality, is a predictor of peers. More specifically, smaller distances smaller distances in terms of centrality make peers more likely to be selected. And that's true whether or not, we've also controlled for whether the peer is a supplier, the peers are rivals. So this centrality, again, has something that just being rivals doesn't capture.
In that case, since centrality is the supplier relationship here, is that a firm level?
No, these
are,
well, it's applied to all firms in the industry the
right.
same.
But it's
But
applied
then,
across.
yeah, this is a firm level, so each one of these is comparing each firm against every other publicly traded firm that could have been chosen as a peer. And what we find is those that are closer in centrality, measured at the industry level, but applied to each firm, are more likely to be chosen as peers. We look to see whether the added, so there, we can see from year to year whether the peer group changes and how. And what we look to see here is whether the peers that get added are closer in centrality and upstreamness, and they are. The drop peers are further away. And that's true whether the drop peers survive or not, because one reason you lose peers is they get acquired by someone else or they go out of business. And so if we restrict it to peers that get dropped but also survive, you still see it's the case that the peers that are getting dropped are the ones that are further away in terms of these network centrality or upstreamness measures. All right, so indulge me for one last slide. We do find that greater use of RPE and CEO compensation contracts is present in more central and upstream industries, and this is the part in bold is kind of exactly what the literature review that we started this with says is not true, that it's not present where expected, but I think our results can be interpreted as if it is present where expected. More specifically, industries that are subject to more exposure to exogenous common shocks, they do in fact use more RPE, and they implement it by using broad indices for peers. So, I mean, if not as if Holmstrom 79 or 82 needs a lot of support, but our results in fact seem consistent with CEO board negotiations having outcomes that are consistent with the fundamental predictions from those theories.